Hello everyone, this is Mr. Jackson, and today we're going to be discussing Unit 1, Lesson 6, where we're going to learn about habitats, niches, and species interactions. So today we're going to have 5 learning objectives, but it really kind of can be combined down into 3. The first thing we want to be able to do is identify the factors that determine and describe habitats and niches. So we just want to understand what those mean. We want to understand what a habitat is and what a niche is. And then we're going to look at communities and 3 factors that specifically shape those communities. Remember that communities refer to all of the living things within a given environment, right? So we want to see how competition, herbivory, and how keystone species all play a part in shaping those communities. And then finally, we're going to want to identify the 3 primary ways that organisms ultimately depend on each other to survive and thrive. Okay, so we're going to have some key vocabulary, quite a bit actually in this lesson. I would also say that much of this lesson is just exposing us to the vocabulary so that we can have these conversations when we look at the ways that habitats and niches and species interact. How all of that is working is ultimately going to depend on our ability to know these key terms. And so the vocab that we have for this lesson, and feel free again to pause as I go through these if you want to review what each of these mean. But our key vocab for this lesson will be habitat, tolerance, niche, resource, competitive exclusion principle, and then we have keystone species, symbiosis, commensalism, mutualism, and parasitism. So that's how each of those words are pronounced. Again, if you'd like to go back or pause and review those definitions before starting, I would highly advise that. All right, so what is a habitat? A habitat is just an area with a particular combination of both physical and biological environmental factors, the living and the non-living things that exist in a place, that ultimately would affect which organisms can live there. You can think of this as an organism's ecological address. This is where we live, and it's all of the living and non-living parts of these environments or these ecosystems that ultimately will define what will live where. So that's what a habitat is. And then we need to understand another key term, which is tolerance. And so tolerance, in order to explain and demonstrate this well, I'm going to turn to my little pen tool here, and I'd like for you to be looking at this graph with me here. So as we explain this, hopefully we can make this make a little bit more sense. So tolerance is referring to the range of external conditions within which a species can survive, and therefore if it's surviving, it has the opportunity to reproduce. So this is a range of conditions. Now these conditions can be temperature, resource availability, competition, predators in the environment. It can be any number of things that could ultimately play a part in the stress or relative ease of surviving in this environment. And it can be species specific. So for example, today's discussion will be looking at several different types of species. We can use an easy example like rabbits for this first discussion. So rabbits will, within their environment, they're going to have what's referred to as an optimum range, where most rabbits, okay, so we can see on the left side here, this is referring to population, so we can see here in the middle, this is perfect for most rabbits. And we have this optimum range where the majority of rabbits that live in this environment are going to survive and thrive. These are the ideal circumstances in terms of temperature, maybe low predator count. The space for all of them is ample. All of the resources they need are there. Plenty of mating opportunities. This is optimal for these rabbits. And just outside of optimal, let's say on the left side here, and the right side, these could represent where we fall just above or just below these optimum ranges. And so this could mean maybe the temperature is a little too low, or the number of predators is a little too high. It can be any one of those conditions that would ultimately provide extra stress. And so we call this zone outside of the optimal range, we call this zone the zone of stress. And this zone can be high or low. Again, this is just going to be a little bit of added challenge. We can still survive here, right? Anywhere from this line of that lower limit all the way up to this line of the upper limit. Everything in between, we can survive if we're rabbits. We're not in that optimal range anymore. We do have stress. And ultimately, whenever we fall outside of those optimal ranges for some condition, individuals are now going to have to expend more energy to maintain what we call, and this is a very important word, homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is just referring to a balance between our internal conditions as individuals and our external conditions, right? So this is how we make sure that we stay not too hot, not too cold, we're pretty well fed, we're not dying of thirst, right? We're maintaining balance with our environments. But whenever we fall outside of these optimum ranges, we get into these zones of stress. This means that now, in order to survive and maintain that homeostasis, that balance that we want to stay at, we have to expend a lot more energy in order to do it. And if we're having to put a lot more energy into just survival or maintaining that homeostasis, well, then at that point, there's going to be less energy available for growing and for reproducing. So those things that we really care about for the ongoing well-being of our species, growth and reproduction, those are going to be put under stress, right? That is going to be challenged. So the last part of this is that if I were to fall outside of that lower limit of my species tolerance, right? If it gets, let's say, too low on resources, or it's too cold, or space is so limited that I pass that lower limit, at that point, I have fallen outside of my range of tolerance. And at that point, we can expect that we would not survive as a species. Same thing goes if we were to fall outside of that upper limit, right? If stressors get way too high, again, we fall outside of that range of tolerance, or what we can tolerate. And if we can't tolerate those stresses, then we will not survive as a species. Okay? So tolerance is going to be unique to each environment. It's going to be unique to each species within those environments. But we do have to understand that each species has that tolerance for all of the stressors that are within its environment, and ultimately those can challenge what we call homeostasis for each of those. So we defined what habitats are, we defined what tolerances look like within those habitats for certain species, and the next thing that we need to go into is what's called a niche for those species within those habitats. And so a species niche includes this range of physical and biological conditions in which a species can survive and reproduce, as well as the way it goes about getting the resources it needs to do that. Okay, so that's what a niche is. Easy way to remember this, guys, is a niche is like an organism's role or job or occupation within its habitat address, right? So wherever a species lives is its habitat. Whatever its specific job or role is within that habitat, that is what we refer to as a niche. And those niches are going to be highly, highly specific to individual species. No two species are going to occupy the same niche. And so we want to look a little bit more into what that is using our physical example here on the screen. Okay, so we see that we have a single spruce tree, and over to my right, I've got 3 different species of birds or warblers. Okay, now these are color-coded to kind of show you where each of these species exist within this single spruce tree. But the important thing to distinguish here is that even though this is a single tree, each of these specific types of birds don't technically have the exact same habitat, because they inhabit the different areas that are highlighted here in the tree. You can see the Cape May warbler inhabits the very top of the spruce tree. The middle, in terms of height and in terms of depth of this spruce tree, is going to be inhabited by the bay-breasted warbler. And then the yellow-rumped warbler hangs out more towards the bottom. Okay? Now, if they all occupy different specific parts of this tree or different unique habitats, that means that each of them can maintain their own unique niche, right? Because living in these different parts of the tree is ultimately going to provide a different living circumstance for each of these birds in terms of potential predators, resource availability, amount of light or space availability. All of that is going to be very unique to each part of the tree, and all of that is going to be very unique to each type of warbler. And so I could ask you another question. What would happen if two of these species tried to occupy the same niche in the same tree at the same time? Again, this cannot happen because if I'm occupying the same space at the same time, one of us, either, let's say if the yellow-rumped warbler and the bay-breasted warbler meet in the middle here. At the middle, there are going to be environmental conditions, and one of us is going to be more or less competitive. One of us is going to be more fit to survive and to compete for the limited space or the limited resources. And whichever one of us happens to be the fittest in that same environment at that same time, we are the ones that are going to end up occupying that niche, which is going to be to exclude the other, right? And so if we have two different species trying to occupy the same space at the same time, whichever one is most fit is ultimately going to be the one that is having an easier time surviving and therefore reproducing. The other species that isn't as fit is going to be having a harder time surviving and reproducing. And so we'll see them less and less over time until it's exclusively the more fit species in that specific role, in that specific habitat. So that's the way that niches and habitats work. You will have one species that basically is going to occupy a certain niche within a certain environment at a certain time. Now, sometimes you are going to have two species or the same species. They're going to come together and we're going to have to compete for limited resources. Maybe that's for space or for food or for mating opportunities. We're going to have times where we're just simply going to, as the picture suggests, we're going to butt heads. And so we have a couple of different types of competition that we want to identify, we want to assign terms to, okay? Now, when organisms attempt to use those same limited resources in the same place at the same time, that struggle or that competition can be either intraspecific or interspecific. Intraspecific is going to be between members of the same species. An easy way to remember that is intra-specific is kind of like the word intramural, where if you play intramural sports, you're going to be playing sports within your similar communities or within the same gender. There's going to be something that resembles sameness to that. And so intra is same species competition, like you see in this image here with the two goats butting heads. Interspecific is between members of different species. This is often happening for space or for food supplies. Interspecific, easy way to remember that would be like interstate, where a road connects multiple or different states. So anytime you see intra, think same. Inter, think different, right? So a good example would be like if a lion and a cheetah were trying to chase the same gazelle. That would be interspecific competition between those two breeds of cat. And then it's important to identify that by causing species to divide resources, competition is ultimately going to help determine what numbers and kinds of species in a community can exist, and then the niche that each one of them will occupy. right? So competition is a really big factor for how these species will ultimately divide land amongst themselves, divide resources, and what roles they're going to have. And then we get to a really important term, and we've already alluded to a little bit, but let's go ahead and make sure we put a name to it. The competitive exclusion principle, it states that no two species can occupy the exactly the same niche at exactly the same time in the same place. Okay? Now, if two species attempt to do so, we've already said, one species will ultimately be better at competing for limited resources and will then eventually just exclude the other species. A really good example that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with if you've ever watched the movie The Lion King is that struggle for who's going to be the king of Pride Rock, right? Who is going to lead the pride of lions? It's this, classic struggle between Scar and Mufasa in the early part of that movie. And so that's one example where if there is an exact role or job within a habitat, there can only be one species, or in this example, one individual that can occupy that role. There can only be one most fit, most competitive individual or species to occupy that role. And then if you look over at the right side here at our graph, this gives a really good example of what competitive exclusion looks like. And so I wanted to break that down real quick. I'm going to use my pen tool again. So you can see here you have a certain strain of bacteria. We'll just call this Aurelia. Yeah, Aurelia. I hope I'm saying that right. And this is showing what kind of growth is possible whenever this bacteria is grown alone. So whenever this bacteria is grown alone, it's represented in the dash line here. You can see it's actually pretty high population, right? This population, if it's by itself, can actually do pretty well, right? So it's growing, it's surviving, it's reproducing pretty well up until it reaches an environmental limitation. We call that carrying capacity. And also, you can see that caudatum, this other type of bacteria, whenever it's kept alone, reaches a very similar carrying capacity, right? Both populations, when kept isolated, are able to survive and reproduce and thrive, right? But it's only whenever we combine the two, right? Whenever we see these solid lines and we combine the two together, where we see if we grow those two together, one of them is going to be more fit and more deserving, more capable of acquiring resources. And so we see that Aurelia, represented in red, will actually survive and reproduce and thrive at the expense of caudatum, right? You see caudatum tries to initially compete, but once we start rising, right? Once Aurelia starts rising in population and taking all the resources available for itself, the population of caudatum decreases all the way until the point where we're almost next to zero, right? So we've really all but excluded this caudatum species from this from this environment. So that is what competitive exclusion means. Two species, when left by themselves, could very well thrive within a certain environment. But whenever you put them in the same environment, at the same time, with the same limited supply of resources, only one of them are going to rise to be more competitive. And therefore, you're going to see the other one be completely excluded. And then we want to get into another really, really important contributor for how species interact, and that's that interaction between predator and prey. And so this is a really good example. We're actually going to be looking at this specific graph in a lot more detail and analyzing what it means later in this lesson. We're going to also have a lab activity that is specific to exactly these two species that you see here, with bobcats and rabbits, both existing as predator for the bobcat and prey as the rabbit within this same environment. And so there are things that we want to establish within this. Now, this is a very simple graphic example of the relationship between predator, you can see that here in blue, and prey, which are, again, the rabbits. You can see those here in red. And we have, in this situation, 5 predator-prey cycles. These are repeatable. They will have a similar trend or similar pattern with time that you can see here. And this is representing their relative population sizes. So you can see that as a whole, there's typically a lot more of the prey, a lot more of the rabbits than there are the bobcats. And one important thing to distinguish on this graph before we move forward is that in this circumstance, we have a repeated cycle where as we have the rabbit population increase up to a certain point, up to a certain carrying capacity, at that point, with there being so many of that prey species available to be hunted, then you see the predator population will increase slightly behind where the prey species is. And as that prey species starts to be hunted more and more by the increasing number of bobcats, then you start to see as that population decreases, well, then there are less rabbits available for the bobcats, and so you see a decrease in the bobcat population because that supply or that resource of animals or rabbits to be hunted gets smaller. And so they have to compete more, less are able to survive and reproduce, and so then there is a decrease in that population. Once that population of predators gets low enough, right here, once that population, whoop, this happened last time, sorry. Let's see if I can decrease here. Sorry, we'll exit the drawing. There we go. Yeah, sorry about that, guys. All right, so we'll go back real quick. So once that population gets smaller, let's say right here, so we're with that population of bobcat, it has hit a low point. Once there are less bobcats that are hunting the number of rabbits, well, then at that point there are less predators for the rabbits, and those rabbits are able to survive, to reproduce, and they will again rise or grow exponentially. Well, that's just going to keep happening. They'll rise or grow exponentially until they hit their carrying capacity again, at which point the cycle will repeat. Okay, so that's just one trend that we can identify in this simple example. As the prey species increases, so can the predator species. When one goes down, so does the other. So it's just showing the influence that both predator and prey will have on the survival of the other. So that's predator-prey. And then we want to go into a pretty similar example with herbivory, which we've seen this term before in a previous lesson, but just to review, this is referring to the interaction in which an herbivore feeds on primary producers, or those photosynthetic plants, okay? So herbivores, it's important to understand, herbivores are kind of similar to the predators in this situation, and the producers, those plants, are similar to the prey, right? It works the exact same way. And herbivores are able to affect the size and the distribution of plant populations within that community, and they're also able to determine the places that certain plants can survive and grow. So based off of feeding patterns and just where these species tend to live, and their needs within those environments, they can actually shape a lot of the vegetation within that environment. And we call that tendency to do so herbivory, right? So it's very similar to the predator and prey situation that we just looked at. And it's just instead now between herbivores and the plant producers within those spaces. And then we want to get to a really big term. So this is keystone species, and a keystone species is going to play a vital and very unique role in maintaining structure, stability, and diversity in an ecosystem. These are typically predators, but not always, but these are typically going to be a single species that has a very large effect on the community structure. They're so important that changes to their own population can literally impact the structure and stability of the entire ecosystem. And so I want to break this down real quick, because this image that I gave you is actually a really good example of a keystone species, where at the center, holding this pillar together, or this arch together, are these river otters. And these river otters are a really good example. We'll explore this a little bit more in a case study moving forward, but these river otters are a really good example of a keystone species, because if these river otters that happen to prey on sea anemones, if these river otters were to, let's say, have an external stressor that falls outside of their range of tolerance. This could be a really good example, could be human beings that start hunting these river otters to endangered status or even to extinction. If we take away these otters from their ecosystems and the species that they prey on are no longer having to deal with natural predators, well then those species could therefore experience what we call exponential growth, where there is no limitation. And so any form of life that these sea anemones were then to feed on, they would basically be able to feed and reproduce and feed more until those species that they eat would go into extinction. And if those species go extinct, well then, from our previous conversations on food chains and food webs, we understand that when things start to go extinct, we really start to hurt the entire food web, and we basically just cripple the overall biodiversity of those ecosystems, right? So, key thing to take away here is that keystone species are going to play an essential role within communities in basically placing natural and necessary limits on other species within an environment. And then we get to our final slide of the lesson. This is referring to symbiosis. Symbiosis is referring to the interactions of organisms within an environment. Okay, so there are 3 specific types of interactions that we want to define between organisms. Each one is very specific, and you're going to see these different interactions a lot within any environment. And so we want to make sure that we define what those are. The first one is commensalism. This is where we have a relationship in which one organism benefits and the other is sort of neutral. It doesn't help the other one, it doesn't harm the other one. So one benefits and the other isn't really affected by it. Okay, so a good example of commensalism would be, let's say, a certain type of bird that rides on the back of elephants, and the birds basically eat the flies that are on or near the elephant's back. The elephants aren't really harmed. They're not really helped in any way. The flies aren't really bothering the elephant, but the birds were to get a free meal. That's a really good example. So again, commensalism, one benefits and the other is sort of neutral. It's not really helped or harmed. Mutualism, this is an example that we have actually over here, where these clownfish and sea anemones are actually helping each other survive. This is a relationship between 2 species in which both species are able to benefit. So mutualism, there's a mutual benefit to 2 species. And then finally, we have parasitism. This is, as you would maybe guess by the name, this is where we're going to have a parasite involved, where this is the relationship in which one organism is living inside or on another one, and it's actually harming that other species. So ticks or ringworms, any type of parasite that you can think of where it's feeding or living off of another, and it's actually harming or damaging the health of that other organism that is the host, that would be an example of parasitism. Okay, so one more easy way to remember this. Okay, so if we have commensalism, one benefits and the other is sort of neutral. For mutualism, both are going to see the positive in that. Both are going to benefit. And then finally, for parasitism, one is going to benefit, but the other is actually going to be harmed. There's going to be a negative involved for that other species. Okay? So those are the three, based on our learning objectives. We wanted to understand those three specific terms for the ways that any two species might interact with each other or cooperate together. And so that will bring us to the end of this lesson. And so please feel free to go back to those learning objectives, to those key terms, make sure that those are making sense and that we have a functional knowledge of those important concepts. And that'll be it for this lesson, and I hope that this was helpful.